Thunder on the Right by Alan Crawford. Read by Fax Fivem. Chapter 5. Protecting Hearth and Home, the Woman's Place. Opening with the following quote.
As long as we've got schools in this country, we're going to have to realize that there are people who are trying to destroy our basic concepts. We've got to be on guard from now on.
An anonymous West Virginia textbook protester quoted in Conservative Digest, June 1975. While the men of the New Right symbolically guard the frontier from external threats, exercising their energies on macho issues like gun ownership, national defense, law and order, and free market economics, the women, with some help from sympathetic male politicians and preachers, protect hearth and home from threats to their way of life. Like the women of the Old West, they work with the school and church to safeguard the home and neighborhood. Their struggles over textbook selection, busing, abortion, gay rights, and the Equal Rights Amendment have produced charismatic political leaders and cult figures like Phyllis Schlafly, Anita Bryant, and the Reverend Jerry Falwell. They have become a political force of awesome power, with the potential of becoming more powerful still given their zeal and numbers. At stake, as they see it, is nothing less than the future of society itself and the values that will prevail in it. On one side, threatening traditional values are the feminists, the liberals, the university, communities, minorities, residents of urban centers, and the media. On the other, the side of the angels are the so-called pro-family forces, the leadership of the New Right and its disgruntled constituents, plus a growing political movement of fundamentalist evangelical ministers speaking from their television and radio pulpits in support of right-wing politics. Both sides are competing for the soul of America. The wave of so-called permissiveness that is sweeping America has convinced many of these people that the very foundations of their society are beginning to shake. A belief that has gained credence outside right-wing circles. There is an array of data to support their fears and a renewed defense of traditional morality and in the institution of the family by neoconservatives and, on the left, by radicals like Christopher Lasch. Divorce rates are soaring, venereal disease has reached an epidemic proportion, teenage pregnancies, despite great emphasis on sex education and the availability of contraceptives, are increasing. Abortions in some cities have outstripped live births. Homosexuality is on the rise. More and more women are having children out of wedlock. Drug abuse and teenage alcoholism are reaching into the high schools, where violence and crime increase and test scores plummet. Middle Americans, alarmed over these developments, are convinced that their morality, indeed their way of life, is under attack by upper-class liberalism, and that the time has come to fight back, to protect it from the enemies within. Control of the culture. The New Right women, with the help of the fundamentalist ministers, are determined to reassert control of the culture, to further not only specific political goals, but to assure that the values they believe in are allowed to survive and prevail. No better summary of their fear exists, perhaps, than this fundraising letter from Christian Voice, a fundamentalist political lobby.
This letter will make you angry, but I'm going to tell you the truth about militant gays, liberal educators, cruel atheists, and godless politicians. Dear friend, I am rushing you this urgent letter because the children in your neighborhood are in danger. How would you feel if tomorrow your child was taught by a practicing homosexual? Was bused 20 to 30 miles away to school every morning? Was forced to attend classes in a school where all religion is banned? If you think this could never happen, you are in for a shock!
The rest of the letter, signed by the Reverend Robert G. Grant, head of Christian Voice, said that the drive for homosexual rights, busing, the ban on prayer in public schools, and other related issues are
just a fraction of a master plan to destroy everything that is good and moral here in America.
This master plan is orchestrated by
godless militant gays, liberal educators, and vicious atheists
who, unless stopped,
will tell you how your children will be educated.
They will, that is, determine America's future by shaping the minds and hearts of youth, by undermining the values instilled in the home. According to the New Right, this attempt to undermine the home influence was at the root of the effort in 1979 to create a cabinet-level Department of Education. The Right Woman, a newsletter for committed female activists, stated that the effort was part of a broader offensive which included increasing funding for daycare centers and stepped-up regulation of private schools.
There is an underlying assumption in all three, that the care and education of children is the primary responsibility of the state. This view is contrary to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which has always maintained that education and care of children is the primary responsibility of parents. God has not only blessed parents with children, He has given the responsibility for nurturing children to parents. To interfere or to attempt to interfere with a parent's right is a violation of First Amendment rights.
Busing is also seen as part of this offensive against the family. In his book, Clear and Present Dangers, 1975, M. Stanton Evans argues, for example, that the real rationale for busing is that busing removes the child from his home for as many hours as possible before and after school. This, Evans wrote,
maximizes the amount of time a child is away from his home,
and minimizes the influence of his parents. Busing also entails a form of race mixing by providing for integration of the schools, thereby choosing for parents the kind of communities in which their children will be raised. The issue of textbook selection and the removal from school libraries of books considered objectionable by parents is also intended to protect the family and, by extension, the neighborhood and its values. Textbook protesters invariably see themselves as upholding the values of the local community against the alien influences of school administrators, who are often from other regions or at least have been infected at their colleges or universities by pernicious outside influence, thus becoming progressive influences hostile to traditional values. The Equal Rights Amendment, perhaps most of all, is viewed by the New Right women as an attempt to undermine the family by withdrawing privileges that keep the family together by protecting the woman in her traditional role within the family, and without which the family, they believe, would disintegrate. The revolt of the New Right women is clearly a rearguard action to arrest the society's growing acceptance of views more liberal than their own. It is, in this sense, a status revolt, growing out of deep anxieties on the part of those Americans who, in Ben Wattenberg's words, are
unyoung, unpoor, and unblack, middle-aged, middle-income, and middle-minded,
who fear that the culture is being controlled more and more by new morality liberals. These Americans resent the fact that many of the relevant social questions are being resolved by others. They sense a loss of their own social status, resulting in attitudes which Friedrich Nietzsche described in the late 19th century as ressentiment, a term now used to explain the social behavior of persons frustrated by their roles in society. David R. Schweitzer, author of Status Frustration and Conservatism in Comparative Perspective, a contemporary study of the concept, believes that
what is at stake for increasing numbers of Americans and Europeans alike is not so much economic survival as achieving or maintaining high social status.
Status frustration, Schweitzer says, afflicts those who see their prestige in the society threatened by the upward mobility of groups, such as American blacks, traditionally below them on the social ladder. For Americans, this insecurity is increased by the lack of respect shown to them and their values by upper-class prestige givers. This can explain the resistance to busing and affirmative action of many lower middle-class whites. Status resentment frequently results in the appearance of right-wing backlash groups, which attempt to re-establish, through formal political processes, the social support that the group's values once commanded. Thus, the Ku Klux Klan or the John Birch Society, extreme examples, are responses to perceived threats. Analyzing the constituencies of Barry Goldwater in '64 and George Wallace in '68, the political scientist James McElroy III, in Radicals or Conservatives, the Contemporary American Right, in 1971, concluded that both these movements surfaced, at least in part, in response to feelings that society had withdrawn its approval from the values the groups upheld. McEvoy observes that, for both groups, interest in politics was largely symbolic. Symbolic politics is
the politics of groups that enjoy relatively greater representation than newly challenging groups, but which are somewhat marginal with respect to their relations with the dominant segments of the society. In the case of declining groups, the target of their hostility and criticism is the society at large.
The New Right is such a symbolic movement. A movement of social protest whose preferred issues, the hearth and home issues of the New Right women, are often non-political, fringe issues at best. They seek through victory to regain lost status, to embarrass or humiliate their enemies in the Eastern liberal establishment, and to regain control of the culture. It is a politics that is almost wholly reactionary. The defense of women's privilege. New Right women hope to stave off the liberal challenge and assure the survival of their way of life by defeating the Equal Rights Amendment. It is clear from the writings of anti-ERA activist Phyllis Schlafly that the new right women do not want equality but preferential treatment, which Schlafly calls rights. In the Phyllis Schlafly report, she has written,
Wives have traditionally had in this country a great variety of extensive rights based on their marital status as a result of our public policy to respect the family as the basic unit of society, and as a statutory and common law balance to the biological fact that only women have babies. These rights, which vary from state to state, include the wife's right of financial support in an ongoing marriage, the right of separate maintenance and payment of attorney's fees during divorce litigation, the right to alimony after divorce, the right to a presumption of custody of her children, rights against her husband's alienation of his property during his life or by will, and a variety of special benefits accorded to widows.
She calls such a system benign discrimination. A skillful organizer with an ability to create fierce loyalties.
There are women who would kill for Phyllis,
a conservative woman told me. Schlafly has been remarkably successful in her efforts to block ratification of the ERA, which in 1980 seemed permanently stalled despite backing by the White House and a congressional extension for ratification. Her nationwide grassroots organization has posted monitors in each of 59 legislative districts in her native Illinois. Her national 50,000-member organization has two names, Eagle Forum and Stop ERA. How are the leaders of local and state affiliates chosen, I asked her.
I pick them,
Schlafly said. A neatly coiffured woman with an attractive but hard face, Schlafly is ambitious, intense, seemingly tireless and powerful.
I really think I have more power right here with this organization than I would as a senator,
she has said. In 1978, when Illinois Republican Daniel Crane was seeking the 22nd congressional seat, his campaign organizers turned over one of their district offices to Schlafly volunteers. Working a phone bank at Crane headquarters was Schlafly. Eagle Jeanette Boone, a Republican precinct committee woman who was once a member of the John Birch Society and who had resigned from the Birchers to join Eagle Forum. The Eagles, she told me,
are far more effective at getting things done.
She decided to perform volunteer work for Crane, she said, because of his opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. Judy Mack, wife of a factory supervisor and a Schlafly supporter, worked for Crane because
he is a family man and a Christian man,
she told me. The self-assertion of women of the right has manifested itself in some open criticism of Schlafly. One of these women is Maureen Reagan, the articulate daughter of Ronald Reagan, and with a varied career as an actress, a talk show personality, and a Republican campaign consultant. Reagan stated in an interview conducted for the New Guard in 1976 that, in her opinion, Schlafly thinks the Equal Rights Amendment is a
communist plot
to require same-sex bathrooms. Critical of Schlafly for focusing on this single issue and blaming it on many of the problems facing society today, Reagan said that she would not be surprised if the anti-ERA activist blamed the amendment for the fact that the Soviet Union has
more submarines
than the United States does. Reagan supports the Equal Rights Amendment, believing it to be a conservative measure that would diminish the power of the federal government, saying she regrets the
bigoted
position conservatives have taken towards the women's movement. She is at a loss to explain their position. She calls the ERA another step towards releasing the individual from governmental control, which she notes
is what my father says he wants to do.
Reagan compared the ERA to consenting adults laws, denounced by the right as a
homosexuals' Bill of Rights.
On the contrary, she believes that such legislation liberates heterosexuals as well, by decreeing that the bedroom is no place for governmental interference. Who supports a family, the husband or the wife, is similarly a matter to be determined by the husband and the wife and not by the government. Juanita Barnett, a Republican activist from Illinois once employed by the American Legislative Exchange Council, told me that the secret of Schlafly's success is the conservative men
who have given Schlafly a platform and let her be the spokesman on this issue. Phyllis can say things that no man could get away with saying. She serves their cause, and they use her in full knowledge of what they are doing. She is the biggest tool that conservative men who want their women barefoot and pregnant have.
Schlafly scoffs at the notion that as a political activist, author, and lecturer she embodies the kind of self-assertion that she claims to loathe in feminists.
Look, I've never argued that women should not have careers, and it is true that I have everything that the women's libbers wish they had: a rewarding career, a wonderful husband, and a beautiful family.
When Anita Bryant led the crusade against a gay rights ordinance in Dade County, Florida in 1977, She touched off a nationwide controversy. She activated hundreds of new right women who view the rise of homosexuality, like the Equal Rights Amendment, as a threat to the family and the way of life that the family represents. The maintenance of traditional sexual roles, they believe, is essential to the survival of the traditional family. Because they demand traditional role models for young children in the schools, they especially oppose the employment of homosexual teachers. The born-again Christian entertainer started a mini-movement dedicated to locking the closet door on homosexuals. It first took political form in a nationwide organization called Save Our Children Incorporated. There is a footnote here which reads, it was first called Save Our Children, then changed to Protect America's Children, to avoid confusion with the Save the Children Federation. Also, I should say, for anyone at home who's having a trickier time following this, this is a reference to how in 1977, Miami, Florida, instituted a county ordinance that, according to its Wikipedia page, banned discrimination in areas of housing, employment, and public accommodation based on sexual orientation. The purpose of the Save Our Children movement was to organize for a referendum to repeal that ordinance. It did succeed, and eventually Anita Bryant was heckled by a gay rights activist who threw a pie in her face. I only mention this because, come on, it's a pie in the face. Like, you can't fight a pie to the face. In the wake of Bryant's victory in Dade County came 6 other anti-gay rights victories, although a second measure put to Florida voters lost. In April of '78, voters in St. Paul, Minnesota, by a margin of 2-1, repealed by initiative a gay rights ordinance. In May, voters in Wichita, Kansas, repealed by 5-1 margin an existing gay rights ordinance, and, later that month, voters in Eugene, Oregon, repealed by referendum another ordinance, this time by a vote of 2-1. Only in California, where a ballot measure, Proposition 6, was opposed by conservatives like William F. Buckley Jr. and Ronald Reagan, did the anti-gay rights forces lose. Save Our Children Incorporated was involved in each of the controversies. 17 full-time staff members were working with the Bryant Organization in 1979. At that time, the leaders planned to branch out into production of television and radio specials to publicize
God, family, and country
rallies. Executive Director Ed Rowe, a fundamentalist minister, told me that Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina was a
very helpful friend
whose
wise counsel
was very important in the organization's early stages. According to Mike Thompson, a Florida public relations specialist active in right-wing politics who worked closely with Bryant in Dade County, a
kind of cooperation
existed between Save Our Children Incorporated and Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA. He told Conservative Digest,
for example, several Florida state senators voted against the ERA because our campaign indirectly alerted them to the homosexual implications of ERA. In fact, some political observers say the 2 people who did most to turn around the Florida Senate on ERA were Phyllis Schlafly and Anita Bryant.
Those who supported Bryant in Florida are a broad-based group, and Thompson points with pride to the fact that the majority of Black, Catholic, and Jewish voters, most of whom are ordinarily Democrats, voted against the gay rights ordinance. 27 of 31 Dade County rabbis who took a position on the issue sided with Bryant. 2 other key leaders in the fight were liberal Democrat Bob Daley, who once worked for Congressman Claude Pepper of Florida, and Bob Skidell, a Democrat who was president of the Miami Beach Lodge of B'nai B'rith. Once the political struggles of '77 and '78 subsided, Bryant's organization directed its energies into a new organization, Anita Bryant Ministries, a non-denominational operation dedicated to counseling
people oppressed by moral problems,
Rowe said. Those
oppressed by moral problems
are usually homosexuals, thousands of whom, Rowe said, approached Bryant after the Dade County controversy, seeking spiritual guidance. A counseling center was established in Miami.
In excess of 1,000
homosexuals have been treated, he told me. There is a footnote here which reads the following. One homosexual who went to the counseling center, intending to write a scathing story, reported in The Advocate that he found friendliness instead of a bunch of religious fanatics who would try to brainwash him.
Not once was I made to feel uncomfortable by the men and women working in Bryant's offices. If they knew I was queer, and I'm sure they did, it didn't seem to bother them. I met some decent people who are dedicated and sincere in their religious beliefs and their love of God and their fellow man.
Through a direct mail fundraising campaign in which Bryant asked for a
gift of love,
Rowe estimates that the organization raised
upwards of $1 million
in 1977 alone. Although it is an important part of the pro-family coalition, the National Right to Life movement, a successful, broad-based, and well-organized coalition, functions as part of the constituency of the New Right, but does not share some of its views on issues other than abortion. Nevertheless, with the Right to Life movement's proven ability to motivate citizens to cast their votes on the basis of a single issue, its members, in one sense at least, epitomize the New Right at its maximum strength and intensity. Their more generalized concern for the family and their opposition to social engineering of liberals suggests that they have much in common with the New Right. Nevertheless, it is the strength of the Right to Lifers that they have not diluted their single-minded constituency by trying to make common cause with, say, the gun lobby. As a result of their single-minded zeal, they may be one of the most powerful political forces in the country. The Right to Lifers, with much justification, are proud of the way their movement cuts across ideological lines, drawing huge support, for example, from New Deal Democrats of the industrial Northeast. They seem wary, therefore, of attempts to influence them by professional right-wingers who are associated with what appears to be a much narrower constituency. In 1979, one Right to Life lobbyist, Taya Rossi Barron, a Washington attorney, resigned from the committee after she saw signs that it had
started to ally itself with other conservative groups.
In 1978, she said anti-abortionists had joined forces with New Right groups in an unsuccessful effort to block extension of the time period for approving the Equal Rights Amendment.
You need the votes of moderates and liberals,
she said.
A conservative alliance is bad for the Right to Life movement.
However, there is little evidence that the Right to Lifers generally share the same overriding anxieties as the New Right activists. Mrs. McCormack, for example, favors gun registration, daycare centers for the poor, détente with the Soviets, and abolition of capital punishment, all positions that strike the New Right as dangerously liberal. Subversion in the schools. Broad concern about the condition of the public schools has given rise to a booming private school movement and to increased involvement by New Right women in the day-to-day functioning of the schools, a traditionally female role. Noting increasing violence in the schools and the declining test scores, right-wing parents trace these problems to liberal attitudes of teachers and administrators seeking to minimize their influence by playing greater roles in textbook selection, even by removing from school libraries books they consider objectionable. They have been so effective in their efforts to monitor books that a study by the National Council of Teachers of English in '78 showed that censorship of books, school newspapers, and other curriculum materials in public schools had increased in the last 15 years by 78%. Parents were most concerned, the study found, by texts and library books that presented attitudes and lifestyles of those of different cultural backgrounds.
It appears the most common objection was to the language of the books, but this is ambiguous. It sometimes refers to the grammar or dialect, or it may refer to profanity or so-called obscenity. Next in frequency were objections to sex or erotic qualities in the books. It is noteworthy that relatively few objections of an ideological sort appear.
Alice Moore is an articulate and soft-spoken young mother of 4 school-aged children in Charleston, West Virginia, the wife of a fundamentalist minister who came to national attention in 1974 as leader of the textbook protests of Kanawha County. Alarmed over the nature of the textbooks in the public schools, she set out to do something about them. She won election to the school board after objecting to the school system's sex ed program. In the school board election of '78, her Back to Basics ticket swept to power and now controlled the Kanawha County School Board. It was a fierce battle. When the controversy peaked in 1975, wildcat strikes by members of the United Mine Workers erupted. A school building was bombed, and the Reverend Marvin Hornan, an independent fundamentalist minister in nearby Cabin Creek, was convicted of conspiring to bomb the school building and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Even the Ku Klux Klan showed up to offer its services, which were rebuffed by Moore and her allies.
What is at issue here? What we are fighting for?
she told me,
is simply who is going to have control over the schools, the parents and the taxpayers and the people who live here, or the educational specialists, the administrators, the people from other places who have been trying to tell us what is best for our children. We think we are competent to make those decisions for ourselves.
As Curtis Seltzer, writing in the Liberal Nation magazine, observed, perusal of the books, which included works by Eldridge Cleaver, Germaine Greer, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti,
reveal that white working-class parents from coal fields and southern mountains do have legitimate grounds for complaint. The editing reflects a value system that runs counter to most of what they cherish. The supplementary books in particular play out the alienation felt by urban intellectuals and university militants of the 60s, who seemed to the protesters to have taken over the publishing houses in New York. Some of the selections were unpatriotic, sacrilegious, and pro-minorities, and they would, as the parents predicted, legitimize different values and raise heretofore taboo questions. Equally important was the almost total exclusion of people like themselves from the so-called multicultural texts. The editors had not thought that coal miners or country folk or Appalachians or working people were either distinguishable groups or important enough to include. Paradoxically, the board's attempt to broaden the English curriculum had shifted the spectrum away from the majority of citizens in the country.
Mrs. Moore was successful in her efforts in part because of help provided by the husband and wife team of Mel and Norma Gabler, for several years involved in textbook struggles in their native Texas, and by James T. McKenna, a lawyer sent to act as counsel for the protesting parents by the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation, in '75, formed the National Congress for Educational Excellence to unite the widely scattered parents' groups, estimated to number roughly 200. The effort was only modestly successful. Jill Wilson, a Wisconsin housewife active in the Canossians' concern for their schools and people of America responding to educational needs in today's society, or parents, reports
that efforts to form a nationwide organization to coordinate the activities of the textbook protesters met with little success, its meeting between the leaders erupting in quarrels that prevented genuine unity. Nevertheless, these meetings provided an opportunity for the activists to meet one another, and many remain in close contact on an informal basis.
As might be expected, these are shoestring operations. Parents, the group with which Mrs. Wilson is affiliated, exists on $5 donations to cover postage for its mimeograph newsletter. Protesting parents won a major victory in '79 when federal judge George C. Pratt of Long Island upheld the 1975 decision of the Island Trees Long Island Board of Education to ban from its libraries books by Kurt Vonnegut, Bernard Malamud, and Langston Hughes. The Island Trees story began when 3 board members attended a state conference held by People of New York United, or Pony U, a right-wing parents group. At the conference, they obtained a list of 32 objectionable books and promptly discovered 9 of the 32 on the shelves of the district high school library. A 10th book was found in the junior high school library and 11th on the reading list for a literature course for high school seniors. The school board banned all of them, calling them
anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy. While removal of such books from a school library may indeed, in this court's view, does reflect a misguided educational philosophy,
Pratt said, the board has the right to remove the books because
one of the principal functions of public education is indoctrinative, to transmit the basic values of the community. A constitutionally required book tenure principle would infringe upon an elected school board's discretion in determining what community values were to be transmitted.
Hijacking the school bus. The anti-busing forces, a far-flung collection of what appear to be ad hoc local organizations, are convinced, like the textbook protesters, that the federal government is out to destroy their way of life, substituting its own alien values for theirs. So-called social engineering, they believe, is again at work, with busing being used to achieve ends believed desirable by liberals in Washington and in the judiciary, but by few parents, black or white. While there appears to be no national organization to oppose busing, new right leaders have been involved in anti-busing efforts when local controversies have arisen. In Massachusetts, for example, Howard Phillips worked closely with the anti-busing protesters of South Boston and still maintains close contact with the activists of the South Boston Information Center, organizing regular luncheon meetings. And in Los Angeles, former Young Americans for Freedom activist Arnold Steinberg organized the Bus Stop program and raised money for its anti-busing activities through a sophisticated direct mail fundraising campaign. Although busing is a
hearth and home
issue concerning children in the schools, it has been commandeered for the most part by men of the New Right, perhaps because of the involvement of blacks and the threat of violence, from both of which New Right men want to protect their womenfolk. Onward, Christian soldiers! Important allies of the New Right women in protecting hearth and home, school and community from liberal onslaught are certain fundamentalist ministers who are becoming increasingly involved in right-wing politics. Their following is immense, and the power they wield from the television and radio pulpits may well make them a political force of enormous impact in the 1980s. Benefiting from the growth of fundamentalist churches and the decline in membership in liberal Protestant churches, the Southern Baptist Convention alone gained almost 2 million members, from 10.77 million in 1965 to 12.51 million in 74. These ministers represent a revolt against the move toward
relevance
and
secularism
in the churches. Facts 5 from here. I was a little bit confused at first as to what the deal against relevance is, and I wanted to say it seems to be that by relevance he's referring to relativism or moral relativism rather than the more modern definition of relevance referring to something being kind of important or front and center. As the Reverend Jerry Falwell, the most prominent of the new right-wing evangelists, said of his own militancy,
Jesus was not a pacifist, he was not a sissy.
Falwell, a fundamentalist from Lynchburg, Virginia, services his growing flock from his old-time gospel hour, which airs on 325 television stations and 300 radio stations each week, netting roughly $1 million to the coffers of his Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg and its affiliated colleges and schools. During the days of the civil rights movement, Falwell spoke out against clergymen who were involved in politics, a position since reversed, on the grounds that the church is now being assaulted and attacked. The result is his far-reaching Clean Up America crusade and a political organization, Moral Majority. As Falwell explained in a Capitol Hill rally in April of '79, the time has come to
fight the pornography, obscenity, vulgarity, profanity, that, under the guise of sex education and values clarification, literally pervades the literature
that children read in the public schools. Falwell is also alarmed by homosexuality and bids his followers to send their dollars to fight these and related evils.
We are very much trying to create emotional involvement in these issues,
he said.
We are going to single out those people in government who are against what we consider to be the Bible moralist position, and we're going to inform the public.
Falwell announced his intention in 1979, for example, to oppose the presidential candidacy of Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts. In '77, Falwell shared his pulpit with his close friend Anita Bryant. He once called for a speedy return to the
McCarthy era,
where all communists should be registered,
and we should stamp it on their foreheads and send them back to Russia.
In September of '79, he drew criticism when addressing an I Love America rally on the Capitol grounds in Richmond, Virginia. He admonished his supporters not to be anti-Semitic. The only reason some of them do not like Jews, he said, is because they
can make more money accidentally than you can on purpose.
He later said that the statement was made in jest, that he is
a Zionist and very pro-Israel, and have always come down pretty hard on anti-Semitics.
He has not come down hard, however, on racists, and for several years the school he ran in Lynchburg was all white. Other right-wing fundamentalist ministers also owe much to
the electronic church,
the vast radio and television operations run by the fundamentalists. It is immense, with 36 wholly religious television channels, 1,300 religious radio stations, and dozens of gospel television shows that buy time on commercial stations, reaching an estimated 100 million Americans each week. The flagship of the new evangelical talk shows is the 700 Club of the Christian Broadcasting Network, which operates out of a $20 million facility in Virginia Beach. 700 Club host Pat Robison, a genial graduate of Yale Law School and son of a U.S. Senator, in '79, spoke out against
the humanistic, atheistic, hedonistic influence on American government,
which he said was the result of control by the
Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations.
Also a boogeyman of the John Birch Society. Of growing stature is the Reverend James Robison, a fiery Dallas evangelist who was dropped from a local commercial station in Dallas, but reinstated after 12,000 fans turned out to express their support for a controversial sermon against homosexuality, which had temporarily cost Robison his airtime. Their constituency is estimated to consist of roughly 50 million born-again Christians, mostly Protestant, plus 30 million moral conservative Roman Catholics, and a few million Mormons and Jews. As Pat Robertson put it,
"We have enough votes to run the country, and when the people say we've had enough, we are going to take over."
This takeover is to be mounted through Falwell's Moral Majority Incorporated, a political organization formed in '79 that plans, so Conservative Digest has reported,
to mobilize at least 2 million Americans to work for pro-God, pro-family policies in government.
Its executive director is the Reverend Bob Billings, who in '78 described himself to me as
the liaison between Congress and the Christian community.
A fundamentalist from Maryland. Billings already works closely with his own organization, Christian Voice, a Pasadena-based political lobby with access to the same mailing list used by Moral Majority. Christian Voice plans to rate legislators on a morality scale according to their stands on homosexuality, abortion, pornography, prayer in the schools, and other issues. Like Carl McIntyre and other right-wing evangelists of the 50s and 60s, the electronic churchmen of the 70s and 80s are stressing political concerns, determined, as Falwell puts it, to
turn this into a Christian nation.
One manifestation of the close association between the fundamentalists and the right-wingers' shared anxieties over school busing and textbooks is the emergence of hundreds of Christian private schools, estimated by the Wall Street Journal to be a $2 billion a year industry. Supporters include Senators Helm of North Carolina, Paul Exalt of Nevada, Gordon Humphrey of New Hampshire, and Congressman Robert K. Dornan of California, all of whom attended Falwell's Capitol Hill rally. The growing political clout of the born-again lobby was felt in '78 as the Moral Majority constituency claimed credit for blocking the Equal Rights Amendment for denying election to liberal Iowa Senator Dick Clark and for repealing, by referenda, gay rights ordinances. Politicians are beginning to pay heed. In mid-'79, Republican presidential hopeful John Connally held a private meeting at his ranch with top religious broadcasters and activists, including Falwell and Billings, and as one participant told the U.S. News and World Report,
"At the end of the meeting, some of those guys were ready to carry Connally out of there on their shoulders."
A second presidential aspirant, Illinois Congressman Philip Crane, a born-again Christian, was asked to appear on the 700 Club. In October of '79, fundraiser Richard Vigueri, in his magazine Conservative Digest, called for a national day
of fasting and prayer
to
devote completely to prayer, meditation, thanks, and repentance for our sins.
The new right is encouraged by the growing alliance between the pro-family forces and the born-again ministers, but some traditional conservatives are troubled by the trend.
Fundamentalist ministers on television like Jerry Falwell may claim to be politically conservative, but they betray true conservative principles when they lobby for legislation that would intrude the government into individuals' private lives, as Falwell has done in his various anti-gay campaigns in Florida and California,
said Jerry Rowell, a conservative writer and teacher in Lynchburg, Virginia, who has followed Falwell's career for several years. The potential political muscle of this alliance is bolstered by zeal and dedication. Campaigning Reports, a newsletter of political tactics, noted that the
zealous participant multiplies his minority status through activism.
A study by the National Right to Life Committee in '79 revealed, for example, that its members show no hesitation about total political participation. More than 70% of those interviewed had voted in a primary or general election in '78. Another 50% donated from $25 to $50 to at least one pro-life campaign. A high 55% they would vote against a candidate solely on the issue of right to life, even if they agreed with him on virtually every other important issue of the race. More than 35% were prepared, they said, to cross party lines to vote for an anti-abortion candidate. This is especially significant when voter turnout is low, as it increasingly has been. When voter participation is down, single-issue minorities who get their supporters to the polls can exercise power out of all proportion to their numbers. As Maurice Rosenblatt of the Committee for the Study of the American Electorate told the New York Times, the nation may be
losing the votes of the broadly concerned citizen, leaving the field to those motivated by narrow parochial and emotional interests.
Judging by their zeal alone, the new right women have the potential to become a significant and perhaps enormous political force in the 80s. Their self-assertion, already impressive, no doubt comes as a surprise to American liberals who assume that conservative women believe their place is in the home with the children and not in the rough and tumble world of politics, and that their opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment suggests that they are somehow fighting against their own best interests. Nothing could be further from the truth. As Maryland Congresswoman Marjorie Holt, a right-wing Republican, explained,
I believe that we have a special responsibility, that women have to be very careful because we have been cast in the role of child bearers, and I think we have the responsibility to preserve the family.
Joanne Gasper, editor of the Washington-based The Right Woman, said,
These women are concerned about family issues. They see it as a threat to the way they live their lives, and that's why they're getting involved now.
As the women of the new right see it, they are fulfilling traditional roles women have always played, safeguarding the home from unhealthy influences, while their men are out making a living and protecting the frontier from external threats. Like the hardy pioneer women without whose influence settling and civilizing the Old West would have been impossible.